You pray, but God doesn't answer. There's something Tozer understood about modern Christianity that most people are afraid to admit. You can go to church every Sunday, read your Bible daily, and even lead a small group, yet still be living a complete spiritual lie. The question isn't whether you're doing Christian things. The question is whether you actually know the God you claim to serve. Right now, millions of people are sitting in churches, singing worship songs, and walking away feeling absolutely nothing. They're praying prayers that bounce off the ceiling. They're reading scripture that never penetrates their heart. They're living what they think is a Christian life, but something deep inside tells them it's all just religious performance. If that describes you, this isn't going to be comfortable, but it might be exactly what your soul needs to hear. Tozer spent his entire ministry confronting this exact problem. He saw churches full of people who knew about God but had never actually encountered Him. People who could recite Bible verses but had never felt the weight of God's presence. People who were busy doing Christian activities but were spiritually dead inside. He called it what it was, a religious sham, and he wasn't afraid to tell the truth even when it hurt. The beauty is that recognizing these signs isn't meant to condemn you. It's meant to wake you up to something far better than the shallow spiritual experience you've been settling for. Because once you see the difference between real Christianity and religious play acting, you can finally start pursuing the kind of relationship with God that actually satisfies your soul. What you're about to discover might challenge everything you think you know about your faith, but it could also be the beginning of the most authentic spiritual journey you've ever experienced. This isn't about becoming more religious. It's about becoming more real. The problem Tozer identified in his generation has only gotten worse in ours. We've created a version of Christianity that requires almost no sacrifice, demands very little change, and promises maximum comfort. We've turned the most radical message in human history into something that fits neatly into our weekend schedule and doesn't interfere with our real priorities. We've made Jesus into a cosmic life coach whose main job is to help us feel better about ourselves and get what we want. But here's what Tozer knew that we've forgotten. The God of the Bible isn't interested in being your spiritual accessory. He's not looking for fans who show up once a week to sing His praises and then ignore Him for the rest of their lives. He's not impressed by your religious resume or your ability to use Christian vocabulary. What He's looking for is people who are hungry enough to seek Him with their whole heart, honest enough to admit they don't really know Him, and desperate enough to give up their comfortable spiritual mediocrity. The tragedy is that most people have never been told there's a difference. They think that if they believe the right things intellectually and participate in the right activities externally, they're automatically living the Christian life. They've been taught that Christianity is basically a spiritual insurance policy that guarantees heaven when you die and provides some moral guidance while you're alive. They've never been introduced to the possibility of actually knowing God personally, intimately, experientially. This is why so many people feel spiritually empty despite being religiously active. This is why prayer feels like talking to the ceiling. This is why reading the Bible feels like homework instead of hearing from someone you love. This is why worship services feel like performances instead of encounters with the living God. They're trying to have a relationship with someone they've never actually met. Tozer understood that the human heart was made for God Himself, not just for information about God. He knew that we were designed for intimacy with our Creator, not just intellectual understanding of Christian doctrine. He recognized that true Christianity isn't about improving your life. It's about finding your life in God. And he wasn't afraid to point out when people were settling for a cheap substitute. The first sign that your Christian life might be a sham is something that hits close to home for almost everyone who's ever tried to pray. You can spend hours in prayer, use all the right words, follow all the proper formulas, and yet feel like you're talking to absolutely no one. It's not that you don't believe in prayer intellectually. You know all the verses about prayer. You've heard countless sermons about prayer. You might even teach others about prayer. But when you actually try to pray, it feels empty, mechanical, and one-sided. Tozer would say this happens because you're trying to pray to a God you don't actually know. You're attempting to have a conversation with someone who, to you, is basically a stranger. Think about it this way. If you tried to have an intimate conversation with someone you'd only heard about but never actually met, it would feel awkward and artificial. You might know facts about them. You might even admire them from a distance. But you couldn't have a real relationship with them because there's no personal connection. This is exactly what happens when people try to pray to a God they only know about instead of a God they actually know. They know He's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. They know He sent Jesus to die for their sins. They know He loves them and wants the best for them. But they've never actually experienced His presence, heard His voice, or felt His love in a way that convinced them He's real and personal and actively involved in their life. Real prayer, the kind Tozer experienced and wrote about, happens when you know God well enough to recognize His personality, His character, His heart. When you pray to someone you actually know, prayer becomes conversation instead of monologue. You're not just reciting requests or going through spiritual exercises. You're talking to someone who knows you completely and loves you unconditionally, someone whose presence you can sense and whose responses you can recognize. The difference is like trying to have a meaningful conversation with a photograph versus talking with someone sitting right next to you. One is flat, lifeless, and unsatisfying. The other is dynamic, interactive, and fulfilling. Most people are praying to a photograph of God instead of the living God Himself. When your prayers feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling, it's usually because you're praying to a God you've only heard about rather than a God you've actually encountered. You're trying to connect with someone who, in your experience, is more like a concept than a person. And you can't have a personal relationship with a concept, no matter how theologically correct that concept might be. The solution isn't to pray harder or longer or with more faith. The solution is to get to know the God you're trying to pray to. And that means moving beyond just learning about Him to actually seeking Him until you find Him. It means being hungry enough to pursue Him beyond Sunday morning services and daily devotions. It means being honest enough to admit that you don't really know Him yet, and desperate enough to do whatever it takes to change that. The second sign that your Christian life might be a sham is something that happens in churches across the country every single weekend. You can participate in worship services, sing all the songs, raise your hands, maybe even cry during the emotional moments, and yet walk away feeling exactly the same as when you walked in. The music was good, the atmosphere was energetic, the experience was pleasant, but nothing actually happened to your soul. Tozer saw this happening in his own generation, but it's reached epidemic proportions in ours. We've turned worship into entertainment and convinced ourselves that being emotionally moved by music is the same thing as encountering God. We've created worship experiences that are designed to make people feel good, rather than to facilitate genuine meetings with the Almighty. We measure the success of our worship by how many people enjoyed it, instead of by how many people were changed by it. But here's what Tozer knew about real worship. When you actually encounter God, when you come face to face with His holiness and majesty and love, it does something to you that no amount of emotional music or inspiring atmosphere can duplicate. It changes you from the inside out. It convicts you, comforts you, challenges you, and transforms you. You don't walk away from a real encounter with God feeling the same. You walk away different. Real worship happens when you become aware of who God actually is, not just who you've been told He is. It happens when His presence becomes more real to you than the music, the lights, the crowd, or the feelings. It happens when you stop performing worship and start experiencing it. And when that happens, everything changes. The problem is that most people have never experienced this kind of worship, so they don't know what they're missing. They think that getting emotional during a song or feeling inspired by a sermon is as good as it gets. They've settled for spiritual entertainment instead of divine encounter. They're content with feeling good about God instead of actually meeting with God. This is why so many people can be religiously active but spiritually empty. They're confusing emotional response with spiritual reality. They're mistaking psychological manipulation for divine intervention. They're satisfied with having their feelings stirred when what their soul actually needs is to have their life rearranged by an encounter with the living God. True worship, the kind that Tozer experienced and advocated, happens when you become so aware of God's presence that everything else fades into the background. It's not about the music or the atmosphere or the crowd. It's about you and God. It's personal, intimate, and transformative. And when it happens, you know you've experienced something real, something that could never be manufactured or manipulated. If your worship experiences leave you unchanged, if you can participate in religious activities without being impacted by them, if you can sing about God's love and power without actually feeling God's love and power, then you might be experiencing religious entertainment instead of authentic worship, and there's a world of difference between the two. The third sign that your Christian life might be a sham cuts to the heart of why most people are attracted to Christianity in the first place. You can be genuinely concerned about your eternal destiny, sincerely want to be a good person, and really hope that God will help you with your problems, but still be motivated by what you can get from God rather than by who God actually is. Your faith is essentially a cosmic transaction where you give God your belief and good behavior in exchange for forgiveness, blessing, and eternal security. This is perhaps the most difficult sign to recognize because it seems so reasonable. After all, isn't it natural to want God's help with your problems? Isn't it smart to be concerned about where you'll spend eternity? Isn't it appropriate to want God's blessings on your life? Of course it is. But when those desires become your primary motivation for faith, you end up relating to God more like a spiritual vending machine than like a person worth knowing for his own sake. Tozer understood the difference between seeking God for what he can do and seeking God for who he is. He knew that while God is generous with his gifts, he reserves his presence for those who love him, not just for those who want to use him. He recognized that the deepest hunger of the human heart isn't for God's stuff, it's for God himself. Real Christianity begins when you become convinced that God is worth knowing, even if he never did another thing for you. It happens when you stop being primarily motivated by what you can get from God and start being motivated by who God is. It's the difference between loving someone for what they can give you and loving someone for who they are. When your faith is primarily motivated by benefits, prayer becomes a wish list instead of communion. Bible reading becomes a search for promises instead of a search for God's heart. Church attendance becomes an obligation instead of an opportunity. Worship becomes a performance instead of an encounter. Everything becomes about you and what you need rather than about God and who he is. But when you're genuinely hungry for God himself, everything changes. Prayer becomes about getting closer to him, not just getting things from him. Bible reading becomes about hearing his voice, not just learning his principles. Church becomes about meeting with him, not just fulfilling religious duties. Worship becomes about giving yourself to him, not just expressing your needs to him. This shift from self-centered faith to God-centered faith is what Tozer called the difference between knowing about God and knowing God. It's the difference between being a religious consumer and being a true worshiper. It's the difference between using God and loving God. The challenge is that this kind of faith requires something that most people aren't willing to give up, which is the illusion that you're in control of your relationship with God. When you're primarily motivated by what you can get from God, you can maintain the fantasy that you're managing the relationship. You pray the right prayers, do the right things, believe the right doctrines, and expect God to respond according to your expectations. But when you start seeking God for who he is, rather than for what he can do, you have to let him be God. You have to accept that he might not always give you what you want, but he'll always give you what you need. You have to be willing to love him even when you don't understand him. You have to trust him even when you can't see how things are going to work out. This is scary for people who are used to being in control, but it's the only way to experience the kind of relationship with God that actually satisfies. Because ultimately, what your soul is hungry for isn't God's gifts, it's God's presence. And God's presence is reserved for those who seek him for his own sake, not for those who are just trying to get something from him. So how do you move from a fake Christian life to a real one? How do you stop going through the motions and start experiencing genuine spiritual reality? The answer isn't complicated, but it isn't easy either. It requires the one thing that most people are reluctant to give, which is complete honesty about where you actually are spiritually. The first step is admitting that you don't really know God the way you thought you did. This isn't about doubting your salvation or questioning your faith. It's about being honest enough to acknowledge that knowing about God and knowing God personally are two different things. Most people resist this admission because they think it reflects poorly on their spiritual maturity. But actually, it's the beginning of real spiritual maturity. Tozer often said that the most dangerous person in the church is someone who thinks they know God but doesn't, because they're not hungry enough to seek him. The safest person in the church is someone who realizes they don't know God but wants to, because they'll do whatever it takes to find Him. Spiritual hunger is always the prerequisite for spiritual satisfaction. Once you admit that you don't really know God yet, the next step is deciding that you actually want to know Him. This might sound obvious, but it's not. Many people are content with knowing about God because actually knowing God requires changes they're not sure they want to make. Knowing God personally means letting Him have real influence in your life. It means caring more about what He thinks than what other people think. It means being willing to obey Him even when it's inconvenient or costly. But if you're genuinely hungry for authentic spiritual experience, if you're tired of religious activity that doesn't satisfy your soul, if you want to know the God you've been hearing about your entire life, then you have to be willing to seek Him with your whole heart, not just during your devotional time or when you're at church, but as the primary pursuit of your life. This is where most people get stuck, because seeking God with your whole heart requires prioritizing your relationship with Him above everything else in your life. It means being willing to change your schedule, your habits, your priorities, and even your relationships if they're keeping you from knowing God better. It means treating your spiritual life as more important than your career, your comfort, your reputation, or your personal plans. The practical aspects of this pursuit aren't mysterious or complicated. They're actually quite simple. You start by setting aside time every day to be alone with God, not just to pray or read the Bible, but to wait in His presence until you sense His reality. You begin reading Scripture not just for information, but for transformation, asking God to speak to you personally through His Word. You approach worship as an opportunity to encounter God, rather than as a religious obligation or social activity. You also start paying attention to your motives. When you pray, ask yourself whether you're primarily seeking God's presence or God's presence. When you worship, notice whether you're focused on God or on your own emotional experience. When you read the Bible, observe whether you're looking for God's heart or just for principles you can apply to your life. Perhaps most importantly, you start being honest with God about your spiritual condition. Instead of pretending to be more mature than you are, you admit your spiritual poverty and ask Him to help you. Instead of trying to impress Him with your religious knowledge or activity, you confess your need for a real relationship with Him. Instead of demanding that He prove Himself to you, you ask Him to help you recognize His presence when He reveals Himself. The beautiful thing about God is that He responds to genuine spiritual hunger. When you start seeking Him sincerely, He starts revealing Himself personally. When you admit that you don't really know Him, He begins introducing Himself to you. When you stop performing your faith and start pursuing Him authentically, He makes Himself known in ways that convince you He's real, personal, and actively involved in your life. This doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without cost. Real Christianity requires giving up the comfortable spiritual mediocrity that most people settle for. It requires admitting that you've been content with far less than what God wants to give you. It requires being willing to let God change everything about your life that needs to be changed, but the reward is worth any sacrifice you have to make. Because what you gain is exactly what your soul has been longing for, whether you realized it or not. You gain a relationship with the God who created you, loves you, and has been waiting for you to stop going through religious motions and start seeking Him with your whole heart. The tragedy of modern Christianity isn't that people are bad or that churches are failing. The tragedy is that millions of people are settling for a religious experience that leaves them spiritually empty when they could be experiencing the kind of relationship with God that satisfies every longing of their soul. They're living on spiritual junk food when they could be feasting at God's table. They're content with shallow religious activity when they could be experiencing deep spiritual reality. If you recognize yourself in any of these signs, if you've been going through the motions of Christian living without experiencing the reality of Christian life, if you're tired of religious performance and hungry for genuine spiritual experience, then this could be the beginning of the most important journey you've ever taken. Not a journey to become more religious, but a journey to become more real. Not a journey to do more Christian things, but a journey to actually know the Christian God. The question isn't whether you've been doing Christian activities. The question is whether you actually know the God you claim to serve. And if you don't, if you're honest enough to admit that your Christian life has been more about religion than relationship, then you're exactly where every authentic spiritual journey begins. You're ready to stop pretending and start pursuing. You're ready to move from knowing about God to actually knowing God. That's not just a better way to be a Christian. That's the only way to be a Christian that will ever satisfy your soul. Because ultimately, that's what Christianity is supposed to be about. It's not about being religious. It's about knowing God. And once you taste the reality of that relationship, you'll never be content with anything less.